This is probably my favorite CQB video that I've seen because in a lot of ways it portrays the message that I've been trying to relay to you guys in a lot of my CQB videos in sort of a cinematic way, and that is being presented with the worst case scenario. Now, in my opinion, the most important part of what you're going to do in CQB when it comes to making entry is how you behave at the threshold, because if you don't make it past the threshold, then what you do inside the room doesn't matter anyways. And if you're getting shot at the threshold, there's a good chance everything inside the room at that point is going to become very irrelevant. What I don't do on this channel is provide you guys with other people's products that I know very little about and ask you to buy those products so I can make money. If that's something that you appreciate and you enjoy this channel, do me a favor, feed the algorithm down below, leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. The worst case scenario is a prepared defender inside a room who's ready and willing to hurt you. If we're making entry inside of a room and the suspect or the defender is holding his weapon in a down position and we're able to engage that defender as he makes a furtive movement, that's not the worst case scenario. I would argue that's the best case scenario. It's not really all that relevant how many times or how often you make entry into a room in training with paper targets that aren't shooting back, because that's not the worst case scenario. Even if we're utilizing role players, sometimes we can get close to the worst case scenario. We don't often treat those situations as if they're the worst case scenario because role players shoot us and they hit us and then we just pretend like nothing actually happened. So what could be worse than a prepared defender? Well, a prepared defender that's engaging you at the threshold and doesn't even allow you the opportunity to get inside the room because you're eating rounds at the threshold. Now, what in addition could be worse than those two things? A prepared defender engaging you at the threshold, and that's a defender shooting at you from a concealed position. In this video, you see this attacker shooting at the entry team from what they call a murder hole. These are very common in combat situations or overseas, and a lot of times these murder holes are used by US forces as well, but they're used in a way in which these holes are facing outboard or out towards the perimeter on the outside of a house or on the roof of a house to look out into the vast city, the village, whatever it is you're overlooking, but they can oftentimes be found inside of structures as well. Now you might be asking yourself, how is this relevant to law enforcement? Well, in law enforcement, you're not going to encounter a murder hole, but what you will encounter is suspects that are engaging you from concealed positions. Maybe they're under something, maybe they're crouched down, they're just concealing their body, or they're actually shooting at the entry team at the threshold from an adjacent room. Whatever it is you're training around the realities of what you're expecting to encounter, what you're anticipating to encounter, because that's what you should be doing, then you should take a step back and ask yourself, what's the worst case scenario in this situation? For example, for many years, I did hostage rescue training, and what they teach you in hostage rescue training is once you make entry into the room, you create that L, and the suspect may focus on one operator or the other, and then that will open up that suspect for a shot. Sure, that can happen, but that's an ideal scenario. That's not the worst case scenario. So imagining in my mind, well, what could be the worst case scenario? Well, the worst case scenario is a suspect who is using a hostage as a barricade where you can't actually get a shot on him on the entry or at the threshold, and he is engaging the entry team. How much more difficult does it become to put rounds on a bad guy that you can't hit because you don't have a shot while he's shooting at you? And in furtherance of that, how hard is it for you to actually move and close the distance on somebody who's engaging you at the threshold? Well, it's pretty hard. So that, in my opinion, is the worst case scenario. How do we mitigate that from being an issue? And we do that by utilizing a shield, so the shield can eat rounds as we're pushing towards the threat. This video is of Russian soldiers basically demonstrating the wrong way of doing this and then demonstrating the correct way. I'm going to break down their method, why that didn't work, and their solution, and then I'm going to tell you what I think your options are. Initially, you see the Russian soldier blind firing or pre-firing around the threshold. Then you see the number 2 man crossing over either in front of the threshold as if he's going to bypass the threshold to get to the other side, or maybe he's even going to pause in the center of the threshold. And as he's doing that, he gets hit from a position that is concealed and they don't know where the attacker is. The reason this isn't effective is because the defender is not taking accurate rounds, therefore he's not discouraged from engaging these Russian soldiers. The number 2 guy goes down and then they default to what some might call violence of action and dominating the room. So that number 1 soldier goes to make entry, and you can actually see that as he's making entry, he's actually facing the murder hole or facing the front, but his job and responsibility, I would assume at this point, is to actually go to the hard corner. You could imagine if he actually went to the hard corner, that wouldn't have helped him here in this situation. The reason that he loses this fight here is because he still does not know where the attacker is. And then you have the number 2 guy following him in, and it does appear that he's actually going to the hard corner. So it looks like he's probably turning to the right. Again, doesn't know where the attacker is, and he goes down. Now the number 3 guy, who at this point should be checking the center of the room if the number 1 and number 2 guy got to their corners, is entering into a space with a bunch of chaos, a bunch of confusion, 2 guys that are going down. He also has no idea where to look, and the corners still haven't been checked at this point, and so he's engaged, and the number 3 guy goes down. Appears the number 1 guy takes a knee. We'll just say he checks the left side of the room, and now he's checking the center of the room, and the number 2 guy is then moving around him to go to the opposite side of the door. Now, this is a option. I don't think it's necessarily the best option for a few reasons. One, it kind of depends on how soon that number 2 guy is going to move behind you. Is he going to wait? Because he probably should. If you get down to that kneeling position and then you're checking that left side of the room and then the center of the room, and at the same time that number 2 guy is moving around you, well, if you're involved in an engagement there, which you probably will be if you're exposing yourself to this threat, then that number 2 guy, just as a product of moving around you at that moment, is likely to be hit by gunfire, and that's going to be bad. The second reason why I don't think this is necessarily an optimal option is because you're in a kneeling position. When you get into a kneeling position, it does compromise your ability to move and react, especially in a combat zone where a grenade could roll out of the front of the threshold. Being in a kneeling position isn't necessarily somewhere you want to be, and you certainly wouldn't want to be in the kneeling position as somebody is moving around you, because that is going to further restrict your ability to move and get out of the way. Before I go over what my options are, we have to first identify what the objective is and what the priorities are. At best, we want to engage the shooter before he engages us. If we can do that, the chances that we win that encounter are astronomically high. And there's a good chance that if we engage the shooter before he engages us, he may not be capable of engaging us at all. That's the difference between being in a gunfight and being in a shooting. At worst, we then, if we couldn't do that, want to engage that shooter at about the same time he's engaging us or immediately after. There's a good chance that if we're not engaging that suspect and immediately after he's engaged us, one of 2 things are probably happening. We're probably scrambling for our life and trying to make something happen while limiting the levels of destruction, or we're dying. Now, there's 2 caveats to either of those 2 things happening. One, knowing where the target is, seeing where the target is, and being capable of putting accurate rounds on the target. And in order to do that, you need to give yourself 0.25 to about 0.35 seconds to see something, make a decision, and react to that decision. I don't just want to tell you guys what my options are, but I also want to demonstrate how I get to what I think the best option is. You have a lot of guys who will say, oh, all of these are options, right? That's okay, but it's also okay to take that a step further and say, of the options that we have available to us, we think this is the best option. This is sort of the way I think about these things on paper. Now, you've all heard of the curve and being ahead of the curve. Now, imagine you are at the beginning of that curve, and in the middle of the curve, before the curve, or ahead of the curve, you have where the engagement starts. You have where the suspect starts shooting or where that defender starts shooting at you. At the beginning of the curve, this is where you have, at best, the opportunity to see the target and engage the target before being engaged. In the middle, you have where the suspect or the defender starts engaging you, and this is, again, at worst, around about the same time or immediately after the shooting begins. After at worst, way behind the curve, this is where you have what I call catastrophe. Either you're scrambling for your life and trying to make something happen, or you're probably dying. There's a number of different methodologies that could fit in the beginning part of this curve. Obviously, you have staying ahead of the curve, staying left of bang, and OODA loop. OODA loop is a great methodology and philosophy that's taught. The problem is that people are only taught what it means, and they're not taught how to apply it to a very specific tactical situation. And I'm not going to go through observe, orient, decide, and act. You can see how it applies to staying ahead of the curve and what I'm going to continue to discuss here. But I do want to make a quick reference as to what they did, and they just went straight to acting. They decided that they were going to act off of information that they didn't have, and therefore it ended in 3 guys going down inside the threshold, which is something that we're trying to avoid here. Now, these, in my opinion, are better options. You have the option that I've discussed on this channel, which is stepping center. I don't think this is, of my options, the best option, because what's going to happen here is that first guy that's stepping center is he's just going to get shot again from an unknown location, and the chances that he'll be able to do anything, respond, or even tell you what's going on in that moment are pretty small. So what would probably happen, he steps center, he gets shot, the number 2 guy then steps up or tries to take up some of the room from the outside, trying to see where it's coming from, or maybe even just shooting into the room, and we're not really being effective that way, and we're definitely not going into the room at that point, because now we have a guy down outside the threshold, And if we continue to dump into the room like they did, we could just anticipate that we're going to get similar results. The other option that I think is an option, but not necessarily the best option, is the number 1 guy or the number 2 guy panning across the threshold. And there's 2 main reasons why I don't think that this is an ideal option. And the first one, and the most important one, is that you have to understand how long, again, it actually takes you to identify something inside a room, make a decision, and react to what you're seeing. Now, I've taught you guys and told you guys how you can test this on your own by putting your own target inside the room and simply moving past the threshold and seeing about how fast it takes you to identify that target, engage that target, and shoot that target. You're gonna come up with a baseline level of speed at which you could actually walk across that threshold. Now, when you start having somebody else move that target inside of the room, when you start having somebody else put that target in the room where you don't know where it is, you start identifying that it's now taking you longer to assess where the threat is and put rounds on that target. That also means identifying whether it's a shoot or no shoot target. And so you can imagine if you're hiding a target in a room where it's partially available, or especially through a small hole, what are the odds that you're going to be able to see that target, make a decision, and engage that target while moving across the threshold? And I can guarantee you, without a doubt, it's very little to not being capable of doing that at all. And so the slower you move across this threshold, the higher the likelihood is that you're just going to be shot. And that's something that we want to avoid. The other reason why this may not be a good idea, depending on the environment that you're in, and it was in their case, is there is a window on the other side of the door. Obviously, they're just demonstrating something that could be out of play. They weren't taking that into consideration, but it is something that you should consider. Is panning across the door by yourself even an option if you have to turn your back to a window or another door or whatever that may be? And the answer is no, it's not. And so that leaves me with what I think the 2 best options are in this case. The first one is that you actually move across the door in a manner in which you're not actually trying to identify what's inside the room and engage what's inside the room, because I've already told you the likelihood you'll be able to do that is very little to not possible at all. And therefore, you're kind of being used as a decoy in that situation, kind of like when you run the rabbit inside a corner-fed room. The idea here is that as you're doing that, if there is somebody looking at the threshold, maybe he's engaging you but not hitting you because you're moving across the threshold with speed, and that gives that number 2 guy or the number 1 guy, whoever stayed at the door, the opportunity to see where the gunfire is coming from and engage that shooter inside that room. Think of this like that combat situation where you have a soldier or an operator rushing across maybe an intersection or an alleyway, and they're doing that because they don't know where the threat is, and they're reducing the likelihood that they will be shot because of their quick movement. And while they're doing that, they're usually going to have 1 or 2 guys looking in the direction of where the gunfire could be coming from, and if they happen to see where exactly the gunfire is coming from, well, then they can now put accurate rounds on that individual. Again, this may not be an option that's available to you because you might have additional threats down the hallway, or panning across the door or moving across the door at all opens you up to additional threats that you're not willing to do. So that's an option. It may not be the best option depending on the environment that you're in. Obviously, it is a great idea to get set up cross coverage on a door if we can, because we're just getting more guns into the room. We're observing more of the room from the outside before going in. Therefore, once we go into the room, we can then focus our attention into the areas where we haven't actually checked yet. Now, my last option, what I think is the best option that most people are going to have a really hard time understanding for some reason, is that you actually are going to do a slow or somewhat slow pie of the room. Again, because we're working off that 0.25 to 0.35 seconds of identifying where the threat is and then having the opportunity to engage that threat, hopefully before, right? That's going to be difficult to do if he's in a concealed position staring at the threshold waiting for you to expose yourself, or about the same time or immediately after he's engaging us. Also, what that allows us to do is expose little of our body to the threshold. It allows us to, if we do take casualties, those casualties to be not catastrophic, hopefully, and minimize the levels of destruction. And if we do that, it allows us to egress out of that situation more easily and then come up with different solutions to solve that problem. Now people are gonna say, well, this is where they would shoot through the drywall or shoot through the wall and hit the whole team. And I'd just like to refer you back to the curve. I'd like to refer you back to the list of options that you were provided with. And I would like you to ask yourself, of the list of options, which ones do you think are best? I don't believe that providing a almost completely theorized problem without providing any facts, and those facts being at least a number of times where this has actually happened and it's been documented, is actually helpful in this situation. Because then again, I think you're telling us, well, because this is something that could happen or is possibly capable of happening, that your best option is to now dump into the room where there's a good likelihood at least the first three guys are getting killed and the rest of the team probably isn't making it in there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you're feeding the algorithm down below. Don't forget to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you're not already.